Hi everyone, this is Super AntOreo, and welcome to the Banjo's Errand behind the scenes video. Today, I'm going to share with you some details about the development and production of Banjo's Errand. And the first thing I want to start with is why Banjo's Errand exists. Where did the idea for this series come from, and why exactly did I say that this video series was experimental in the first video's description? Well, in order to understand the answer to that question, we'll have to go back in time a little bit. I found out about Smash Machinima back in the olden days of YouTube when I was still in elementary school. I watched stuff like Smash Tasm and The Legend of Olimar, and I was really impressed with how these people took Smash Brothers and could make their own stories with them. I always thought it was really cool, and I kind of wanted to do it myself, but at some point, I kind of forgot all about Machinima and didn't really go back to watching it until Ultimate was announced. That's when I really started to binge a lot of Machinima series, and in particular, I got around to watching Smash King, a series that I never watched back then, and I fell in love with how it was a story that had such an ambitious scope and managed to incorporate so many game elements from Brawl. It's still one of the greatest Machinima series I've ever seen, and was a key motivator for me working on my own. However, those of you who know about the Machinima community know that most of these series suffer from what's called the Machinima curse, where the creator has super ambitious ideas, but only ends up making about a fraction of the show. I was aware of this, and I didn't want to burn myself out with a project even if I had ambition early on. So, while I was coming up with ideas for my own series, I decided to give myself a little bit of a test. Make a series of videos with a simple plot to see if I could see a Machinima series through to the end. And that's where Banjo's Errand came from. And I decided to set it in the world of this Machinima series I was crafting to make it sort of a pilot. That way I could introduce who the characters are to my audience and get some general interest in what the series was like. Of course, the funny thing is, I didn't really come out saying that this was a pilot. I kind of wanted that to be a secret for a while, but I feel like now is a good time to reveal it. I haven't revealed the Machinima series itself. It's still in development because I kind of struggled with motivation for it, just like with Banjo's Errand. But I am a bit more willing to talk about it, and a few plot elements in Part 3 were put in to be sort of teasers for what this big Machinima series is. I will say, though, that since I started Banjo's Errand, the world for my Machinima series has definitely changed a lot, so when I do the series, don't expect it to be exactly like how Banjo's Errand was. Like, just to give you an example, Zelda's character has been rewritten quite a bit. Anyway, let's get to talking about Banjo's Errand itself. Now, I didn't really write a script for Banjo's Errand, but I did write an outline for what I wanted to happen in the story. I also did consider having Kirby be the main character, but I swapped him out for Banjo because Kirby doesn't really talk. Not to say that it would have been impossible to have Kirby be the main character, but I just felt like it'd probably be better to have Banjo be the protagonist instead. And he does happen to be the protag of my Machinima series, so it kind of works having him be the main character of this small side project before we get to the bigger one. The plot for Banjo's Errand was meant to be simple, of a, okay, get this thing, and it goes wrong. Basically, just make it kind of like a sitcom episode, basically, but one of the inspirations for it, I forget what the episode's called, but there's this episode of Kids Next Door where they fight a bunch of villains over a cereal box in a grocery store, and that was kind of like the idea I came up with, like, okay, there's this food item they have to get, but it's like, there's only one of it, and all these characters collectively want it, so they have to fight each other to get it. And said food, the tasty sausages, are an item from Xenoblade. I was just thinking of like, okay, what could the food be? And I was kind of in a Xenoblade mood since Pyra and Mythra were announced for Smash Brothers at the time, and also I was playing through Xenoblade Definitive Edition, and tasty sausages are an actual item you can get in Xenoblade 1, but it's not necessarily a food. But then in Xenoblade 2, it is, so I was like, okay, they're trying to get these tasty sausages for ramen or something. And I guess the whole thing with Kids Next Door was kind of why I did the sticky beard joke because it's like, okay, this is loosely based on a Kids Next Door episode, so I'll just make a sticky beard comment. I'll also admit that, like, the whole thing of Banjo being just happening to be at the castle, it is kind of silly that, like, oh, he got there early, and I even make fun of it in part 2, where Sonic's like, wait, why are you guys at the castle early? And it's never elaborated on. I feel like if I were to make Banjo's Errand now, what I would have done is maybe Zelda finds out that the sausages are, like, they don't have anymore, so she starts calling her friends, and none of them pick up except for Banjo, and that's why he goes out to get them. If I made it today, that's what I would do. During part 1 and part 3 later, Geno, the character from Mario RPG, is mentioned a couple of times, and he never appears. I never intended on him showing up in Banjo's Errand, at first, anyway, but he is an important character for my unannounced machinima project, which is why he's mentioned. His character is a spirit, like the ones from Ultimate, and he's part of a special group of spirits who protect the world, and that's all the information I'll give you about his character. So, near the end of part 1, the part where Banjo gets hit by Kirby and the music cuts out, that was meant to be a joke. In this part, Banjo realizes that, like, oh no, they don't have the sausages, so he starts panicking, and if any of you have seen Roy's Our Boy, the end of the first episode when Roy is having, like, that mental breakdown of, like, oh my gosh, Lucina and Robin are totally gonna get married, and I'm gonna become morbidly obese and live with my cats, each named after every other member of the Fighting for Power Rangers, and no, the black cat will not be the Black Ranger, thank you very much, and furthermore, that's what I was going for. I love Roy's Our Boy, by the way. That's a great machinima. So Banjo was just freaking out, and then Kirby hits him to calm him down, which is why the music cuts away, but I will admit that it's not really, like, made clear that that's what's going on. Like, yeah, there's a lot of text on screen when Banjo's talking, but it's not like I really edited it in a way that made it clear that, like, he was freaking out. So I understand why people were like, oh, why did the music cut out there? Because, yeah, it was meant to be funny, but it didn't come off that way, so I'm sorry. So, let's talk about the original story for Banjo's Errand real quick. Like, what was going to happen initially before I got the criticism. In the original story, Banjo and Kirby would have run into Akira and Min Min at Onett. Sonic would show up there as well to rescue them from the Greninjas. This would tip off our heroes that K. Rool is up to something, so the heroes would head to the Kremlin King's hideout. But they only would have fought 2 of the 3 Greninjas, as one of them was going to be arrested by Falco. Basically, Sans was going to call the cops on them. I don't remember why, other than to inconvenience them, but that was supposed to be Sans' cameo in the original video. Banjo and friends would have arrived at K. Rool's base, only to see that the sausages have been taken from him. K. Rool would have mentioned that he got attacked by the Subspace Legion, which sends our heroes off to find them. Well, not before they see the Enderman behind K. Rool and run away, which confuses him, and he turns around and looks the Enderman in the eyes, sealing his fate. I wasn't going to show the scene where K. Rool sends the Greninjas after Banjo, or him getting attacked by Blood Falcon, but because of the rewrite, I decided to include it anyway, and I think that was a good idea. So the scene with Banjo and K. Rool was supposed to be the end of Part 2. Part 3 would pick up at Gower Plains, which is supposed to be where the final fight was supposed to take place. Not only would the group have found the Subspace Legion there, but they also would have found Bowser, which is why in the final video he is at Gower Plains, as a nod to that cut ending. During this fight, Bowser would help the heroes fight the Legion for the sausages, and during the brawl, the sausages would have been dropped from the stage. Banjo would notice and chase after them to Midgard, where they're given to him by Pyra. Banjo and Pyra initially had no history in the original story, with her even keeping her name from Banjo. Her appearance was meant to be a tease, though her role in the story wasn't finalized at that point. I was going to cut her in the final video, but decided to bring her back to add a bit more to Banjo's backstory. So yeah, part 1 was released, and next thing I know, I got feedback from a couple machinimators, specifically 3 members of the Smashing 13. They gave me feedback that I considered, and that convinced me to rewrite the story from part 2 on. And I was actually working on part 2 at the time, and when I got the feedback, I was like, huh, okay, well, I guess I should restart development production then. So I looked at the story I had and rewrit it so that There were no more convenient characters or coincidences or things happening off screen for the most part. I mean, there are some things that happen that are kind of convenient, but I did make sure that there was a bit more of like cause and effect, I guess would be the right term. Either way, I feel like from part 2 on, things flow a bit more naturally, even if there are some things that are kind of a little rough, particularly with Roy's inclusion in part 3, but we'll get to that. And speaking of Roy, yeah, the whole thing with Mewtwo and Roy in part 1 was meant to just be like a random joke and like wasn't going to have a payoff initially, but then when I was working on part 3, I was like, you know what? I'm going to bring Roy back and actually give that scene a payoff. The Link and Erdrick joke in part 2 was meant to be an Easter egg, a little reference to like, oh yeah, that old project I did, and there's even a bit of continuity with how Erdrick is a therapist in the video, and if I ever do my Machinima series and Erdrick shows up, which he might, since Solo's an important character and he and Erdrick have a bit of history, I would want to continue the whole thing of Erdrick being a therapist because I think it's kind of funny. And we'll get to this later, but Erdrick almost had a minor role in part 3, but this was cut. And speaking of the scene with Erdrick, okay, this is annoying, but the scene where Banjo and Kazooie start calling their friends had to be re-edited because YouTube wouldn't allow me to upload the video otherwise. During that scene, I used the On It song from Earthbound, but apparently that's banned in the US, so I went through the process of YouTube removing the song. But when it did that, the entire scene was just very quiet. So I decided to stop the upload and just remake the scene, which thankfully I still had the footage, so I just re-edited it from memory and put a song from Banjo-Tooie in the song's place, which, you know, that makes a bit more sense. There should be Banjo-Kazooie music in a Banjo-Kazooie themed video, right? So it still worked. But I will say one thing I do love about doing this re-edit. If you listen closely when Cuphead leaves, you can hear the start of his self-destruct sound effect. I noticed it during editing, but I left it in because I thought it was funny. Just like, oh yeah, he leaves, and you just hear the start of it and it cuts away. The Incineroar character was inspired by the chocolate guy from SpongeBob. And he was also added to increase the tension in part 3, though I don't think I really finalized what his role would be. I knew that I wanted him to chase Banjo and Kazooie around like the chocolate guy, though, so that's why he was added, and I think he was even meant to be aggressive towards them when they talk about the sausages, but instead I just thought, why not just have him be like, oh yeah, he gets all excited about the sausages, like, oh, I love those things, I want to be buried in them. Which, when he says that he wants to be buried in sausages, that was meant to be a reference to, I don't know if any of you have played Sly 3, but there's this mission where you're in Venice, and you take the position of this guard, and this guard's like, oh, finally, I can go home to my ma spaghetti. I want to be buried in a pasta sauce. Which, honestly, my grandmother used to make a mean pasta sauce, and I still make that pasta sauce from time to time, and, buddy, I understand your desire. So, as I made fun of in the trailer for part 2, there was a scene involving 2 Inklings that I cut out. Basically, in the scene, Banjo and Kazooie go up to them, the Inklings make fun of Banjo before attacking him, and that was kind of it. I wasn't really liking the scene, so I cut it before I started editing. And speaking of that trailer, I was initially going to make an update video between parts 1 and 2, explaining part 2's progress, and even going over the purpose of the series and why I started it in the first place. Anyway, I did show it to my mom, and she suggested that maybe instead I should just make a trailer for part 2, which is what I did, and I threw in some jokes about making fun of part 1, and I really do like the trailer for part 2, because it's like, it's short, it's silly, it does kind of get the audience excited for the next part. I think it's much better than what I was initially gonna do. During the scene where Banjo and Isabelle are talking, there's a part where Villager is chasing around Duck Hunt. And this is a reference to an earlier concept I had for a machinima, where there was a running gag involving Villager chasing Duck Hunt around. Later on in that same scene, there's a part where Banjo is talking to a character named Carl. He was almost named the Smuggler as a reference to the Ratchet & Clank character. He even would have asked the characters to get Leviathan souls for him, to which Banjo would have said, First of all, wrong game. Second of all, wrong system. And third of all, does this info have anything to do with tasty sausages? I altered the line because I thought some people wouldn't get the joke, and I changed it to golden jigsaw pieces as a nod to the Banjo games. It also gave Kazooie something to say during the montage. And by the way, the reason why I renamed the character Carl was to further distance the joke from Ratchet and Clank, and also because my dad is named Carl, and every single time we watch something that has a character with the name Carl, we have to be like, hey dad, it's you! So like, Carl Weezer from Jimmy Neutron, Carl Fredrickson from Up, it's like, hey dad, it's you! Yeah, so whenever I can, I just put the name Carl in one of my videos. So I kind of joked about this in the trailer for part 2, but the scene with Ken and Terry had to be reshot. I initially shot it on the King of Fighters stage, but I wanted to redo it because the scene wasn't flowing the way I thought it would. However, I remembered that the background characters changed depending on the music, so I decided to change the location to Suzaku Castle. I probably could have just changed the music to whatever song was playing when I first recorded it, but I didn't really think about that at the time, so I was just like, I'll just change the location. The part where Sonic is talking about Min Min's old master is a reference to how Kazuya was announced during Part 2's production. Similarly, Sora was going to make a cameo at the start of Part 3, but it was cut along with the scene he was in. Though Sora is referenced at the end, so he made it into Part 3 anyway. And speaking of Sora, I took a break between Part 2 and Part 3 and planned to resume when the final fighter was announced. But when Sora got announced, school got busy. So I decided to wait until after my semester was done. But my computer and video editor at the time were giving me trouble with editing the videos. Seriously, every time I opened my software to work on Banjo, my computer would instantly power down. So I had to keep it plugged in. Even then, my computer was processing so slowly. I bought a new laptop for the following year, but I still had issues with the video editor, so I switched to Filmora for Part 3B. I initially wanted to finish Banjo with my other editor to keep consistency with the text, but I decided to go ahead and make the change. I was dealing with less than desirable hardware and software, but I swapped it out eventually and finished the series. Now actually, I want to give a little tip here, speaking of editing. So something I did for Part 2 onwards is that I made different project files for chunks of the video. I did this to not overwhelm my computer and continue to do it for the rest of the series. As an example, Part 2 is made of 4 video chunks. The first goes from the beginning to the end of the Incineroar scene. The next one goes from the Asking Around montage to the part with Sans. The third one goes from Sonic's introduction to the credits, and the last one is the scene with K. Rool and the Enderman. If you're wanting to work on Machinima and you're having trouble with your video editor and computer, like maybe it's just running so slowly, I would recommend seeing about maybe, depending on what your project is, breaking the editing up into chunks, so that way you don't overwhelm your computer. Give it a try. Now we get to Part 3. The original opening was going to reveal Roy's comeback, with him successfully getting Mewtwo's lotion at Prism Tower. Now, I mentioned before that Mewtwo and Roy's whole scene was meant to be a one-note joke, but I thought it would be a good idea to bring him back so there could be a payoff to that whole scene. During this initial intro, Roy would meet up with Erdrick on the Spirit Train, and their conversation would be a sort of recap of what's happened so far. Roy would tell Erdrick about how Banjo has gone out to get the sausages, while Erdrick would mention seeing Banjo getting harassed by an Incineroar, which confuses Roy. At that moment, Diddy arrives on the train yelling for help. Here, we would learn that a battle has broken out at New Pork between Banjo's friends, the Greninjas, and the Subspace Legion. The mentioning of the Legion would make Erdrick think about Solo. Diddy would also mention that Banjo instructed him to get help, and that an Incineroar passed by Diddy, mentioning something about tasty sausages. When Roy says he'll go help them, Erdrick stops him to mention something about the Incineroar, and from there we would have gone to the intro. This scene was finished, but I cut it because I was worried about the video's length, and I almost considered cutting Roy out altogether. Also, while the scene is meant to remind the audience about what's going on up until this point, I had come up with the Star Wars opening, which more or less did the same thing, so it felt redundant at the time. Ultimately, I kept Roy in and had to rewrite why he was in the story. Erdrick was completely cut from Part 3, and Diddy's role was shrunken down even more. Speaking of Diddy, he was going to appear near the end of Part A, where, as he says in the cut opening, Banjo would have instructed Diddy to get help, and Diddy would have run past the Incineroar. That would have led to Part 3A's ending, with Banjo and the Incineroar teaming up. Now, the scene with Diddy wasn't edited, but if you pay attention at the end of Part 3A, you can hear him in the background. As a quick reminder, the comedy club that Diddy was at in Part 2 is in Newport, which is why he was there in the first place. In fact, Diddy's comment in Part 3 about how he was in Newport but didn't do anything was meant to make fun of this fact. Now, before I came up with the Star Wars opening, I wanted to do a full-blown intro for this last part, as a way to make it a bit more special. I was going to use the opening song from Sam & Max The Devil's Playhouse, but I didn't have a plan for it outside of the first 10 seconds. I later came up with the idea to make the whole thing a Star Wars parody instead, as, for one thing, it's funny, and for another thing, it can add a bit more backstory to what's going on with Blood Falcon. And after I cut the scene with Roy and Erdrick, the opening also became a bit of a refresher for the audience. I later used that song for the full series trailer of Banjo's Errand. Okay, this one hurt. One of the worst things to happen during Part 3's production is that I accidentally deleted one of the scenes and had to start over. Specifically, the fight scene with the Greninjas and the Legion, which was the first time I ever edited a fight scene for a machinima. It was finished, so I deleted the footage from my computer and the project file. But then I couldn't find the video. I thought I exported it, but it was nowhere to be found, so I reasoned that I must have deleted it by accident. Thankfully, I still had the footage in my Switch, and I kind of remembered which shots I used where, so I was able to remake it. But still, that made me angry. Now, when working on Part 3, I had always intended the video to be one fight scene after another. But at some point during production, I decided to replace the middle fight scene between Banjo's friends and the Legion with something else. I think I had already done fight scenes for the Legion at this point, and I didn't feel like doing more besides the one between Banjo and the Incineroar. I wanted to keep that one in to give the story a satisfying end. I was also worried about the length of the video being too long if I let the fight scene in. Though ironically, I think the thing I was going to do would have made it longer, so I'm glad I didn't go through with it. To be more specific, I was going to have an accountant, representing a fictional studio behind the production of Banjo's Errand, interrupt the battle and say that the show has gone over budget with the fight scenes. Instead, the characters would play a game where they insult each other, and if the other person actually gets insulted, they would get shot by a ray gun. First to getting hit 5 times loses. There was also going to be a joke about the accountant's name being Carl, and how everyone else in this fictional company is also named Carl, which confuses the characters. Another thing is that I considered adding voiceover to this scene too, and I had written a version of the script where they acknowledge it. Anyway, it was a funny scene, and Roy's introduction into Part 3 was even worked into this rewrite. But I decided to go back to how it was originally meant to be. Honestly, I'm glad I didn't go through with the scene. It would have made the video longer than it needed to be, and it would have come out of nowhere. I still have the script for it, so maybe I can repurpose it for a one-off video or something. Although, the dialogue between Banjo and Galactonite during their fight was mostly from this unused script, so at least part of it made it into the final product. Now, on the topic of fight scenes, Part 3 was the first machinima video where I did them, and it was a tricky thing to do. I had to remember which controller was controlling who and try to make the action consistent, both while recording and in editing. I'll admit that the fight scenes are rough, and I definitely could have asked for help with body acting. My friend Bombo even offered to help a couple of times, but I continued by myself, and I hope that if I ever do a fight scene again in machinima, I can plan it out better than this. Again, most of Banjo's Errand is improvised, and that goes for the fight scenes too. If you're an aspiring machinimator, please do not look at my series for reference on how to do a fight scene. Use Smash King as a reference. For a long time, I was struggling to work on Part 3, so after some thought, I decided to split it up into 2 videos. After all, at the time I did it, Mission Impossible and Spider-Verse were both releasing 2-parter movies, so why couldn't I? Eventually, my motivation started to come back for Banjo, partially thanks to the Saturning video I did, and partially thanks to something else. But we'll talk about that in its own video. Part 3A is a long video, but it was almost a little longer. The fight scenes between the Legion and the Greninjas were cut down by half, and the conversation at the start between Solo and Galactonite was trimmed down as well. Not much was lost from this, especially since it would have made the video drag if they were kept in, but the most notable thing that was removed was the mention of the Legion meeting someone in Newport. You might be thinking that it's Kazuya they were meeting up with, but no. Kazuya and Sephiroth were never meant to appear in Banjo's Errand, much less be mentioned. I added them to the ending to add interest to what's going on in this world, but I didn't want them to be included at first. The Legion was going to meet up with a different member, one who I haven't revealed yet. I don't want to give away who it was they were going to meet, but I will say how this character was going to have a role in the story. They would have shown up near the end of the battle, when it seemed that the Legion had lost. The character, who can make people go crazy, would have forced the Incineroar to go psychotic, allowing the Legion to escape. Since I cut the piece of dialogue about them meeting someone, I decided to remove this Legion member from the video, but I guess I could have left it in after all since Kazuya shows up at the end. In the final video, Solo is the reason why the Incineroar goes mad, which I felt still worked, seeing as how Solo is the magic user of the group. Speaking of the Incineroar, I initially considered having him go mad on the spot. I had this idea from my series about characters having a hidden skill that they could tap into, and the Incineroar's is that when he gets hyped up enough, he becomes super powerful at the cost of losing his mind. This is also why Erdrick would have stopped Roy before he ran off, to foreshadow that something is off with the Incineroar. Honestly though, I think it was better to leave it at a character who casts a spell on him. That way we don't have to introduce a new story element near the end. At this point, I knew I wanted to end the series with Banjo winning a fight, but I had trouble deciding how I would go about it. It's made clear in part 2 that Banjo doesn't like to battle, and this continues into part 3 where he's hesitant and refuses to fight. His reason for fighting the Incineroar is his determination to finish the errand and get the sausages back, which is coupled with the fact that he's annoyed at how long it's taken for him to complete a simple task. Initially, I wanted to add some other reason for how he can fight, like him and Kazooie loving to dance to music or something, but I didn't go through the idea because I didn't know how I would time the fight to match the song. I ended up just shooting a fight scene and decided to add music later. Speaking of music, the first song I wanted to use was Athena Sykes' Turnabout theme from Spirit of Justice. But later, I wanted to use Find Your Flame from Sonic Frontiers. But I settled on the theme for Nuts and Bolts, as it fits the scene better. After all, the scene is about Banjo and Kazooie finally going all out for a fight, so the song is almost like their victory theme. Geno was supposed to appear at the end of part 3 and congratulate our heroes with Pyra and Mythra. But when I filmed the scene, I forgot about that and made it about Pyra and Mythra congratulating Banjo instead. To be fair, I wasn't sure how to depict Geno anyway. I didn't want to make him a floating PNG, but I also didn't want to use the Mii Gunner. For one thing, I don't know how to green screen characters yet, and for another thing, I don't have mods, so I can't get the one that changes Geno's head to be more game accurate. The scene still works with Pyra and Mythra showing up though, especially since in my story, they're important to Banjo and Kazooie's past. I almost ended the video without the scene of Zelda thanking Banjo at the end, but I realized that it would have been very unsatisfying if I hadn't done that. Zelda is the reason why Banjo goes on this quest after all, so they should have a moment together before the credits roll. It's a brief moment with them, but I'm glad I got to put it together before wrapping up production. The ending joke with Diddy hitting Sans in the face was something I decided on early on, as I thought it would be funny to have it look like another fight would break out, only for it to cut right to the credits. The funny thing is that this joke is loosely based on the ending of a movie called College Family Road Trip. I think that's the name of it anyway. It's not a film I like. I only saw it once when I was in elementary school and apparently it got bad reviews, but I kind of remember how it ended. The characters are throwing a party and someone walks into the room and locks eyes with another character. That guy gets angry at the other guy and runs over to him to start a fight. Credits. Again, barely remember the movie at all. I might be thinking of a different film entirely, but that scene came to mind when I was planning out the story, so I decided to reference it for part 3. What an absolutely random thing to reference, right? And that is it. That is all the behind-the-scenes details and facts about Banjo's Errand. I may have struggled with motivation for part 3, and there are certainly rough spots in every video. But I like how I gave it my all to finally finish Banjo's Errand for you guys. And I hope that I can put the same effort, if not more effort, into my next Machinima project. Will I be working on that next? Well, maybe, but I will still try to do smaller Machinima projects, maybe, and work on this bigger project in the background. But I hope I can talk about it with you more. For now, though, I'm glad I could finish the series, and I'm glad I could share this information with you. Thank you all so much for watching, have a nice day, and stay tuned for more of Banjo's adventures in the future. I've been recording for almost an hour, oh my gosh!